สวัสดีค่ะก็ขอต้อนรับทุกท่านนะคะเข้าสู่งานเสวนานะคะการกลั่นกรองวัฒนธรรมแบบ very Thai นะคะดิฉันชื่อเมย์สลีลานะคะวันนี้จะมาเป็นพิธีกรสำหรับงานครั้งนี้นะคะสำหรับงานครั้งนี้เนี่ยเป็นส่วนหนึ่งของกิจกรรมนิทรรศการ Hello World เราจะออกแบบอนาคตกันยังไงไม่ทราบว่าทุกท่านได้ไปดูกันมาบ้างหรือยังคะไหนใครไปดูบ้างแล้วคะโอเคค่ะสำหรับใครที่ยังไม่ได้ดูนะคะห้องนิทรรศการ2นะคะยังว่างอยู่นะคะแล้วก็สามารถมาร่วมสนุกกับกิจกรรมกับทาง Visitor Service ได้เลยนะคะและรับของรางวัลที่เป็น Limited Edition จาก TCDC นะคะง่ายๆค่ะแค่เขียน Hashtag นะคะแล้วก็ตามรูปภาพนะคะหรือจะเขียนเป็นไอเดียนะคะใส่ลงมาเพื่อรับของรางวัลจาก TCDC นะคะบอกเลยว่าเป็น Limited Edition มากๆนะคะสามารถแจ้งกับทาง Visitor ได้เลยนะคะและนอกจากนี้นะคะสำหรับกิจกรรมในครั้งนี้เนี่ยมีใครรู้จักคุณฟิลิปมาก่อนไหมคะยังมีมาบ้างแล้วนะคะ I asking like anybody know your background before so some of them knows โอเคค่ะก็คือคุณฟิลิปแบ็กกราวด์ของคุณฟิลิปเนี่ยนะคะนอกจากจะเป็นนักเขียนนะคะ very Thai แล้วนะคะ everyday cultural everyday popular culture I'm sorry with that นอกจากนี้นะคะเขายังเป็นอีดิเตอร์นะคะบรรณาธิการจัดตั้งนิตยสารเมโทรนะคะเป็นนิตยสารที่แนะนำการจัดงานนะคะบันเทิงแล้วก็ไลฟ์สไตล์แห่งแรกของกรุงเทพด้วยนะคะและนอกจากนี้เห็นอย่างนี้เขาก็เป็นช่างภาพด้วยเช่นกันวันนี้เขาก็จะมาพูดถึงมุมมองของความเป็นไทยว่าความเป็นไทยเนี่ยในสายตาของเขาเนี่ยเป็นยังไงนะคะแล้วก็อะไรคือเสน่ห์หรือแบ็กกราวด์หรือคอนเซปต์ของความเป็นไทยที่อยู่เบื้องหลังของจุดนั้นและสร้างอะไรความคิดสร้างสรรค์เหล่านั้นมันน่าสนใจและมีเสน่ห์อย่างไรบ้างนะคะวันนี้ please welcome Mr. Philip Cornwel-Smith I pass the stage to you
Thank you very much Thank you Can you hear me there Is it coming through clearly Well thank you very much TCDC for inviting me to speak today It takes me back to the year around when TCDC opened when I worked with this institute on a project to try and find some design values of popular culture. And at the time, it was a very developing area, and there weren't so many good examples. But several years down the track, we've now, all of us, got a lot more experience and insights about how popular culture is a force for shaping design, particularly in Thailand. And today I'm going to talk about the idea of cultural filters. Now we've all seen this coffee going in to a sock in the street vendor stalls. The way it comes out in Thailand is a bit different than coffee in other countries. And that broadly happens with all kinds of things from outside the culture. They come in one way and then they get modified here a different way. Now, the correct way to start anything in Thai is with this greeting, which I'll call the muk wai. Now, you may wonder, is this foreigners trying to be Thai, or is it Thais trying to be foreign? What's going on here? Now, it's obviously a very commercial symbol, but the head of the Tourism Authority of Thailand actually went to the headquarters of McDonald's in America and presented at one of these statues as a symbol of Thainess. So these things get reprojected out in quite an interesting way. Now I think the best start is to talk about definitions. What do I mean by a cultural filter? And there's two ways of looking at it. One is imports. So how do Thai people filter what comes in? What do they screen out? What do they accept, and what do they adapt? This is a process that's being done by the Thais. There's also some filtering that goes on in terms of people from outside exporting to Thailand, deliberately exporting here, and working out how they might tailor something to Thais. Now, I'm not really looking so much at that side of things, although obviously it affects how companies market products in Thailand, whether it's flavors or how people operate things within the home, all sorts of local tastes. And then there's the export filter, and that is how Thais will consider what they have to present to the outside world and what they might include or exclude in goods that they are presenting as a symbol of the country or as something from the culture that happens to have a sense of Thainess about it. And then there's also the filter that foreigners will apply to things coming from Thailand. Do they accept them or not? Is there something that's far too specific to Thai culture for them to feel is suitable for their culture? Or is it something that they delight in and absorb and then adapt? Now, there is a certain sense in Thailand of cultural exceptionalism, that this is a special place that's different from everywhere else in the world, and it's all very original and very specific to Thailand. Now, one of those symbols of Thainess that people recognize around the world is the tuk-tuk. Thailand actually physically exports tuk-tuks to many countries. I've seen them in Europe. I've seen them in South Africa, physically looking like this with the word Thailand written on the back. But actually, the word Thailand was only written on the back in national colors after the crash in 1997. Before that, it used to have the name of the Japanese manufacturer on the back because it's a hybrid. It's actually a Thai version of the Japanese motor rickshaw. And it comes as a surprise to find that at least 34 countries in the world on 4 continents have tuk-tuks, and many of them call them tuk-tuks. So there is a question, why is the Thai one so famous? Or is it as famous as we think it is? I mean, there's an awful lot more Indian tuk-tuks in the world and more Indonesian tuk-tuks than there are Thai tuk-tuks. But why is the Thai one more famous? Why has it been used as a symbol by artists and various other people to represent not just Thailand but this whole vehicle? And part of it comes from its use of indigenous style. Most of those other tuk-tuks are pretty ugly. I mean, it's generally not a particularly beautiful vehicle. I mean, look at this one on the left here. It really doesn't have a nice sense of grace about it. It's very clumsy. But the tuk-tuk in Thailand, it's very short, but somehow it's quite elegant, and it's got a sense of grace about it. Even though it makes a rasping noise, it's quite friendly. And some of that comes from its use of lines that you can see elsewhere in transportation in Thailand that go back a long way. From the buffalo carts, you see these sweeping lines. Again, in a very short, fundamentally ugly vehicle, you've got a certain sense of grace and line that comes from something deep within the culture and the sense of taste. And you see it in the boats. In old photographs of Bangkok, you'll see the sampans in the canals and on the rivers with these beetle-like backs to them and canopies coming over. And it's got that same kind of spirit. So Thais have taken this Japanese vehicle and made something beautiful using their own cultural reference points. Now, of course, if something comes into the culture and it hasn't been filtered or it doesn't get adapted, it can be quite awkward. The writer Gilda Cordero Fernando, she wrote a book called Pinoy Pop about Philippine popular culture, a bit like very Thai. She called them bumps in our culture. So if it doesn't get adapted, it stays like a stone within your shoe, something like this. It feels a little bit uncomfortable. So there is this impulse to adapt it to the local taste. Now, this has been going on a very long time, so long that it is possibly the distinctive thing about Thainess. It's not invention, it's reinventing imports, and it's been a trait of the culture since its very earliest days. Now, the Museum Siam, which is under the same umbrella as TCDC, under the Office of Knowledge Management, they held an exhibition called Xenomania, which was looking at this fad for foreign things in Thailand and how the Siamese and the Thais and all sorts of people living in this space have adapted foreign things to their own needs. Now, one of those adaptations are the local values. So something coming in gets adapted according to local values, and many of these are moral standpoints. Some of them are just tastes that seem to have been consistent over time. There's a general feeling that you want things to be fairly relaxed and quite beautiful, and maybe on the cute side, that there's also a sense of presenting a certain civilized face to the world. Certainly, you want things to be auspicious in various different ways, whether it's to do with beliefs or hierarchical status, or even if it's lucky. Sanok, fun, plays a very important role in making things feel comfortable within the culture. And, of course, face is extremely important. Imports are often used as a way to express a sense of gaining face. And also, there's a strong sense of uniformity in the culture, the way that things are made to conform to existing systems. And frankly, the Thais are very practical people. They don't take in things that are not useful. They're very selective in that way. And there always has to be a sense of seniority in their emulating masters, giving some credit to the origins, the teachers, and so forth. Now, when I was researching the publications I've worked on here, I looked at loads of examples. I could see these kinds of imports coming in lots of different ways. Now, a lot of Westerners complain about the way that the classical architecture looks sort of clipped onto the front of shop houses and so forth. But what's being filtered in to Thailand is a sense of status from classical architecture, which in the West was used for institutions like banks and palaces and parliaments. And you filtered out the sense of Greek proportion, the mathematical origins, maybe some of those other things that we associate with classical architecture in the West, but you've taken on the sense that it represents something important. Now, back in the 1960s, napkins weren't very common here. They were a luxury object, and they were brought into the restaurants, which generally were mostly Chinese restaurants. And one of the most popular chapters in my book is about these tiny pink tissues that you see in the street stalls. Well, many decades ago, tissues were a rare commodity, which is probably why they're all still cut up into smaller squares. But the reason they're pink was because of those Chinese restaurants. They tried yellow ones and blue ones, and they weren't as popular. But pink resonated with the taste relating to Chinese restaurants, and so that was the one that stuck. So this is how imports get acculturated. Also, it's not just the general public bringing in imports. Officialdom does too. The trooping the colour ceremony in Britain has been adopted around the world as a way of showing military and dress uniforms. But trooping the colour becomes trooping the colours in Thailand, where there's so many rich colours for every different military and armed forces branch that it takes on a totally different character here. It's incredibly multicoloured. In the West, we tend to think of numbers as being very inhuman. And we talk about the phrase from The Prisoner, "I'm not a number, I'm a free man." Well, in Thailand, because of the numerology, numbers gain all kinds of character. I mean, this shop in Marbun Krong was selling elegance numbers, Barami numbers, Haiso numbers, numbers for success in business. So there's a certain sense of numbers having meanings that actually relate to your life. Now, some aspects of Western life come as a bit of a jolt One of those was the advent about 15 years ago of gay pride processions through the center of the city. It was a little bit awkward because sexual relations weren't talked about in public in the same way as in the West. And there was a compromise done that the processions could go ahead as long as they dressed in Thai style. So generally around the world now, whenever there's a gay pride procession, you'll identify the Thais because they're even abroad wearing the Thai costumes, even in Iceland apparently. Another cultural phenomenon that is the adoption of festivals into Thai culture. Thais like celebrating, and when there's a foreign event going on, they'll join in too. One of those, of course, is Christmas. Now, there's a lot of very creative Thai Christmas trees. Every year brings fascinating ones. There was one that I saw after the flood, made out of sandbags. There's lots of ones using recycled objects. I saw one in a temple fair which used fluorescent tubes, and they turned it into a game of a lucky dip. Rather than the baubles being for display, they were like part of a game to play in a sideshow. And we see on the left here the Christmas tree being acculturated into the colours of Chulalongkorn University at Siam Square. And all kinds of creativity happening, like hanging the trees upside down, which is not the first idea we'd have in the West about how to handle a Christmas tree. And then this fascinating one on the right, there's so many ways this has been adapted to Thai sensibility. First of all, the tree has been swapped. It's gone from being a fir to being the national tree, the Galapapruk. And the colour's gone to being yellow, which of course links to His Majesty the King. And this tree has been reconfigured with his insignia at the top of the tree. And instead of the baubles and decorations being just for show, they're interactive. These are all messages written on yellow paper to the king by people who've gone to that location to write notes. So this is a format that you sometimes see, but it's usually done with a bow tree, and people are writing on bow leaves or pieces of paper, often in a heart shape, that are then hung like a message of tribute to the king. And here it's being done on a Christmas tree. So while this isn't an institution in Thailand, you could almost imagine it becoming one. It's that kind of culture that can absorb a different way of using an import in a very sensitive way to the culture. Now, some imports, particularly when they're brought in by authorities, can get very fixed. Now, we tend to think of Thailand as being very faddish. There's a taste for imports that turns over fads very fast. Think of all of those donuts in Siam Paragon and Roti Boy and all these things that came into the country. There was a huge fad for 6 months and then it's gone again. But sometimes things from abroad come in and are part of the official image that is presented, and then they get stuck, sometimes for centuries. The gown that is worn by officials and also is worn by university graduates on their commencement day, they originally are Persian gowns, and they come from around about the 17th century into Thailand, along with various Persian traders and officials. The very first ambassador that Siam sent anywhere was to France, and he was wearing Persian clothes. The Thais sent him off in Persian clothes, not in Thai clothes. So for many, many centuries, the outward image of officialdom has often used foreign imports. Now, you might be familiar with this uniform. It was extremely fashionable 100 years ago. It's the sailor suit from Victorian and Edwardian times, being worn by the girls. And the boys are wearing basically what are Boy Scout uniforms, again popular about 100 years ago. And there's quite a lot of discussion at this time about whether this needs to change or be adapted. But it's a good example of a fashion that was the height of style when it was adopted and then became fixed and now becomes almost like a frozen curio from the past. Now, a lot of the impetus behind foreign things being brought in and being made official as a symbol of Thai-ness comes from the mid-20th century, when if you turned up to a government office wearing something indigenous, you wouldn't get served. You had to dress in a polite shirt with a hat, with socks and shoes and things like this in order to get served in a government office. And these were presented as being the Thai way to dress. So we've got this strange thing happening where a foreign way of dress is being told as the Thai way to dress. This strange contrast runs through the whole of the cultural filter process that happens in Thailand. And this kind of approach of telling people how they should be presenting themselves continues with this Moso campaign that happened recently. Now, I found this T-shirt in Jattajat Market, which explains how to be Thai, apparently. It seems that if you do the Y in a conventional way, it's very Thai. And if you sit put here very politely with your legs to the side, that's also very Thai. But if you get down in the full prostration, that's ultra Thai. But sometimes you can be considered un-Thai. Now, to an outsider, this looks strange. If you're born here and you're from here and you're ethnically part of this place, how can you be un-Thai? What it really gives away is the idea that Thai-ness is an ideology. It's not a description of the circumstances that you find here. It doesn't describe the people's behavior and dress and tastes as they are. It's an instruction about how to be. Now, this is very common around the world. Certainly you find it in countries like France and very famously in America. And I think the phrase un-Thai probably comes from the phrase un-American activities, which happened in the Cold War. And I think they're very much linked. If you were not part of the official Thai way, you were being un-Thai. It ties in with that whole period. Now, sometimes hybrids that are a mixture of Western and Thai can be called un-Thai too. I remember back in the 1990s, this building, which is now Blue Elephant Restaurant, it was the Thai-Chinese Chamber of Commerce, and they were going to demolish it because it hid the view of the lions that were in front of the big new tower at the back. And there was a lot of opposition, and heritage groups like the Association of Siamese Architects and others campaigned to have it preserved. But one of the arguments against preserving it was that it was not Thai. Now, to somebody coming in here from abroad, it looks like it's very Thai. It's got tropical architecture from a certain period. It was the taste of people here at that time, but it doesn't conform to some ideological views about what Thai-ness should be. And we've seen this very recently with the partial demolition of the Supreme Court. This building is one of very few examples of a Thai version of the modern movement. There's very few buildings built this way, and it may be not beautiful by many standards, but it is a symbol of a period, of the taste of the time, of what it was to be Thai in that era. Hence, there's been a sort of stay of execution, and the building is a bit in limbo as to its future. But then many hybrids get branded as Thai, not just in thinking about it, but actually physical promotion having the name Thai put against it. Muay Thai is probably the most famous export from Thailand, apart from its food. And the title Muay Thai actually only started when it became a hybrid. When it was indigenous and local, there was different variations, and they were all called by their local variant. They were Muay Chaya or Muay Korad. They weren't called Muay Thai yet. And even the version that was mixed from all of these different regional types, I think it was Muay Gad Chok or something, I might be mispronouncing it, but where the wrists are bound, and this style has come back as a kind of entertainment display. But Muay Thai only got its name when it merged with the Queensberry rules of boxing, with gloves, with a ring with 4 sides, with rounds of fixed numbers of minutes, and points for scoring. Previously, it was in a often dirt arena, often circular. There were different rules. But in the context of internationalism, in the 1920s, it got the name Thai. Now, pad Thai is, again, one of the most famous dishes around the world. And as a food, it was created in the 1940s as a symbol, and also as something that, well, Thais can have their own noodle dish too. We must have one that's ours. So it got this label, pad Thai. But if you look at the ingredients, it's really much more of a Vietnamese kind of composition. The Thais have made it their own, but really when you look at the types of ingredients and food, it looks Vietnamese. On the right, we've got the Thai national costume, which was a combination of traditional textiles and certain reference points like metal belts and sashes. But it was tailored by Pierre Balmain, the French couturier. He was commissioned by the court to create dresses that would be suitable for Queen Sirikit to wear when she was traveling internationally in the 1960s. And the existing costumes weren't quite appropriate for different needs of that time. She needed evening gowns. She needed more practical clothing for wearing during daytime functions and touring events. So this came about, and it became actually a very successful format because it really hasn't changed much from the formal wear that you see women wearing in high society functions right up to the present day. When we talk about Thai dance, this is another thing that is a symbol of the country, but it becomes very complicated. When the UNESCO Heritage Organization, I forget the exact precise title, I think it's Intangible Heritage List, Cambodia decided to list the jeep and other hand gestures as being a symbol of Cambodian dance. Thailand was up in arms, of course, because this is in part of Thai dance too. And in fact, both countries can register these movements as part of their patrimony of culture. But it does point out the fact that Thai dance is adapted from Khmer dance. And in fact, Khmer dance is then adapted from Thai, and it goes back and forth. The same is true with Burma, the same is true with Java. It's all originated from India. So the point is a bit academic about whose dance it is. It's really about whose variant is which. And even the flag, of course, is in the format of a Western tricolor. So a lot of these symbols are reprojected out in quite a confident way when they come from a very hybrid origin. There we can see the Ramakien, which is the sort of guiding national epic. Of course, it comes from India. And each country that has the Ramakien, which is pretty much the whole of Asia, everywhere east of Turkey and south of Mongolia and north of Australia, has the Ramayana in some form. But the character is different. Hanuman in Thailand is a cheeky character. He's a bit of a womanizer. He's playful. He's always somersaulting on stage. To Indians, this is a bit of a shock. You know, when they have Ramayana festivals, the Indian view of Hanuman is a very respectful general. He mustn't be made fun of. And in Thailand, he's the cheeky one. So it takes on its different character in different countries. Okay, end of part one. I want to now talk about some of the work that I've been doing while I've been here and how I've used filters to try and make these projects happen. And in this 20 years, in fact, this month it's 20 years since I started living in Thailand. I've worked on various projects, but three main ones. One of them was the first city listings magazine in Bangkok. It predated BK. It started in 1994, called Metro Magazine. Some of you might remember it. Then I worked on the Time Out Bangkok guidebook, which is part of a series from the London publishing house Time Out. And then I've done 2 editions of Very Thai. The most recent one came out in the middle of last year with extra chapters and heavily rewritten. So I'd like to talk about what my cultural filters are, what I've been using as a way to sort and evaluate what I'm dealing with here. The first thing is the filters that I don't want to use. There's a lot of ways of looking at Thailand, and I've found myself uncomfortable with a lot of them. The most common is a very exoticized Orientalism, and the Thais do this as well as the foreigners. It's presenting Thailand as a land of tinkle-tonkle music with smiles, and everything's graceful, and it's all tropical, and it's all very exotic. Another view is sensationalist, where everything's very lurid and scandal-ridden and sleazy. There are very dry academic views of the country, of course. There's a lot of literature that is hagiography. It's just gushing. Everything's praise. There's no criticism, no comparisons. The opposite is like the Bangkok Post letters page, which is filled with bitter complaints of people who just can't be happy about the country in any way. In recent decades, there's been a lot of travel writing and advertorial, the kind of language to do with Thailand as a spa destination, hospitality writing. It's all full of lots of adjectives and it's very gushing. And then there's a big trap which I wanted to avoid, and that is describing Thailand as some sort of bizarre oddity. But when things don't make sense to an outsider, there's a tendency to brand it as odd or bizarre or strange or quirky. Well, that's only a statement of their own lack of understanding or their own standpoint relating to something that's not been explained to them. So I took it as my mission to try and explain some of these things that people might think of as strange by looking at the reasons behind them. What is the different logic? It's not illogical, it's just a different logic. It's a different set of cultural values. So this was a very important filter for me to avoid all of these other approaches. Also, I wanted to look at things that are under the radar. They're not the normal thing that is promoted to the outside. Things like the popular culture, street life, everyday things, subcultures, things that are not part of the conventional cliches. I also wanted the audience to relate to the material. So I made the approach in everything I've done very immediate. So it's showing things as they're encountered in the street. So there's not, the pictures are not tidied up with flower arrangements beforehand. It's actually as you see it. And also I wanted to look at the definition of what is counted as culture. We have this word watanatam in Thai, which very much binds culture into a sense of propriety, that it's to do with national development and the face of the country, that it must all be very proper and cultured and righteous even. But there's other types of culture. There's popular culture from the everyday life. There's pop culture that's manufactured as part of entertainment industry. Excuse me. There's folk culture from village life. There's ethnic culture from minorities. And there is actually a long tradition of urban culture in Thailand, which is often avoided. It's heavily influenced by Chinese culture and also Western influence. So these things are maybe not always considered as Thai. The ethnic thing might be viewed as hill tribes. Actually, all of these things involve everybody. Now, in my own approach to writing, I try and take an insider-outsider standpoint. So although I'm an outsider, I try to present, as far as I can, the inside point of view. I try and research beyond the cliches. I do a lot of sorting and classifying and regrouping of my material to try and find the patterns, to try and see what is being missed when it's under a different conventional grouping and different way of sorting. I don't copy directly, but I try and riff on the same subject. That's a musical term from jazz. Imagine Frank Sinatra singing My Way. He didn't write it. It wasn't his song, but he sung it his way, and everyone associates it with him because his version was very particular. So I'm not reinventing the wheel. Other people have done books like I've done before, but I'm trying to do my take on it. I try to narrow the criteria of what I'm looking at to a very clear definition. And generally, the content of Very Thai in particular is purely hybrid things that are part traditional, part modern. They're all mixtures. If anything was purely traditional, I excluded it. And I didn't include anything that was totally international and global. It's only the mixtures that I was looking at. I tried to make the books intellectually serious. You know, they're reference books now, they're used by universities. But the phrasing I want to be accessible. There's a lot of good thinking that's hidden away in academia, and you can't access it because it's written in a totally unreadable way. But there's actually really good ideas, and I try to bring those out. And I try to keep tabs over time about how the thing changes. And now, after being here 20 years, I've got a sense of perspective as well. And I always try to credit the sources and the people I quote. I think that's very important. Everybody wins that way. Now, I also have taken some design cues from different places. I try to use the design to make my point, to emphasize the writing's standpoint. Now, I'm dealing with popular culture, street things. So I didn't pick a Thai font, I picked American typewriter. You know, it's a very generic font, as generic as you could get. And the titles are pretty small, they're not over-imposing, and the subject order in the book was very democratic, and even within the page, I wasn't using a hierarchical layout that you often see in local magazines, where there might be a picture that's not the best picture available, but it's of the most important person on the page, so it goes at the top and is most prominent. This is a design characteristic of Thailand, which I understand, but I didn't want to present it in this book. Partly because I wanted to resort the material. I wanted to show what was generally hidden before by these structures. So I, in many ways, went against some Thai structures in order to show the Thainess of the things that were being overlooked. The colour scheme I took from temple fairs. I made the chapters very short and the book to be a handleable side so people would actually be able to read it. I wanted the cover to have a sort of plasticky, wipe clean feel because I thought it was a bit more sort of linked to the subject. And I also was influenced by some other formats. I do actually use some academic formats in there with things like notes and sources. I also looked at Japanese guidebooks for things. I don't know if you've looked at Japanese books, but they are filled with details about tiny, obscure aspects of every subject. They're explained in minute detail, and I was influenced by this approach. And there's also, the book is very dense. A lot of people complain about this, that the text is fairly small and there's not much white space. Actually, that's intentional. I learned this trick from Time Out, where I used to work. And Time Out was always accused of exactly the same things. And the publisher used to say, you know what, if it's dense and it looks like there's far more than you can possibly take in, people believe you. They're not going to challenge you because it's too much to take on. And also, generally, it is filled with stuff. It does cover as much as possible. And it has a sense of an encyclopedic feel. It's not so easy, perhaps, as a book with lots of white space and big font, but we did increase the font a little bit because I couldn't even read the small font in the first edition anymore. So that was a bit of a talky part there, but I'll get back to some pictures now. Now, when I came to Thailand, I was confronted with a limited range of books about Thailand. And basically, there were insider books and outsider books. Insider books like this one published by the National Identity Board. You actually have a department of government that's about telling you what your national identity is. And this is one of their publications. It's got pictures like oil refineries on the front and pictures of dancers and so forth. It's filled with cliches and developmental stuff. It's all Watanatam. And on the right, this must be probably the first directory of Thailand. It precedes everything else. It's a directory of Bangkok and Siam from 1894. So it's probably the places where English people could buy their Marmite and things like that. Now, of course, one reason why well, I'm looking at this topic is that Thainess is a big issue in discussion here. It's part of the political discourse and social discourse. Pretty much every writer on Thailand in the end comes down to this question of what is Thai. But it's quite interesting to consider that that's also the debate in my own country. People are wondering, what is English? And how is it different from Britishness? I love this title, British as a Second Language. And there's another book called How to Be British that I haven't put up here. But what's quite interesting is almost all of these authors are not English people who've lived in England all their lives. Only one of them is. The rest of them are some kind of outsider. They're either half English and half something else, or they're from other countries like America or Scotland. One of them, Kate Fox, she was brought up in Papua New Guinea by her anthropologist father. So she looks at English people like another tribe wearing different kind of feathers and bones to their nose. She looks at things like gardening and the pub with this kind of look. And in fact, this book has been translated into Thai now, called Angit Angit. And I really recommend it because it's a great way of looking at a country, and I suggest you read it and then look at Thailand with those eyes. She's very funny, and it's excruciating to read this because she's really accurate. but her tools, the way she looks at her own culture, are very good for you to interrogate your own culture and to think, well, yes, we have our own version of that. So I came from England with a background in guidebooks. I've been working for Time Out and various other kinds of publications that do listings, which is sorting the culture and making listings out of it, standardizing addresses, standardizing genres, putting everything into a category. This is not a very Thai way to do things, but it's helped me, it's given me a tool of a way to look at Thailand. And I came to the country with this guidebook, and you can see the cover's held together with sellotape. I travelled a lot here before I settled. And one of the first things I found is that Thais don't tend to like questions very much. But I'm a journalist, and I was brought up with the 5 W's and an H of who, what, when, where, and how. And in Thailand, the what was very often quite startling. What on earth was that? The where became a bit of a problem, because the country wasn't very well mapped. I mean, by mapping, I mean in a broad sense of what things are where, let alone where they are physically in a space. We now have Google, but the cartography in Thailand back in the 90s was terrible, truly terrible. And you couldn't really use a map to get to somewhere. The how things work in Thailand, to an outsider, is a bit of a mystery. Somehow the country operates very functionally. But in a Western mode, we can't see quite how this chaos makes this order. We can't make that connection link, so I've looked into that a lot. The when, this is all very difficult, because Thais don't tend to archive as they go along. And so the records of what happened when is really hard to pin down. I remember talking to somebody in the music business saying that when Grammy was getting into doing greatest hits and compendiums of its artists, it was shocked to find that they'd not kept records, they'd not kept the photographs or press releases and background biographies, or even some of the master tapes. Because it's just not an archiving culture. They do that now, but it's a learning curve. But it's very difficult when you're doing research to try and pin down what exactly happened when and who did it. And the who is particularly tricky. You don't want to name those people who can't be named. And even calling up a restaurant and asking for their credit cards that they take, we find it's a state secret. And who are you to get this information? And of course, as to why, there's a lot of supposition that foreigners can't understand. My question is, can anyone understand? We're all in this boat together, and I don't think any one mind can cover all of this and really get all of its implications. One of the difficulties about Thainess is it's often talked about in isolation as though something's Thai because it's Thai. You've got to have some kind of comparison, some reference points to see what it's like in order to notice the differences. Now, among other reading matter I faced when I came here were fairly traditional ways of looking at Thai life. I mean, they were very useful, but they were about a life that was disappearing, a rural, traditional Thailand that was no longer what I could see in the life of Bangkok very much. And there were some expatriate guides focused on the experience of people moving here and having to get by. So I did a lot of sorting and categorizing, and my models for that were Time Out, where I used to work in London. It was the first City Listings magazine. But that was for a homegrown country in its own language. For me, more useful was Tokyo Journal, which was a magazine written in English for non-Japanese in Tokyo. And from that, we got some ideas. We were riffing on how to do a magazine that would work in Bangkok. And we came up with Metro Magazine. And from the start, we focused on street life. We included all kinds of vendor stalls and things like that inside. We went to the kinds of venues that were never written about in newspapers or magazines. And we would also put things together that didn't used to get put together, like certain venues were used to always being the default place to go, whether it was Brown Sugar and the Bamboo Bar for jazz. But when we put them on a list of half a dozen places to go for jazz, suddenly the price of the beer mattered to some people, and certain venues didn't like being put in print. It became very sensitive. We broke a few stories. I think we were the first publication, certainly in English, to talk about the indie culture, and also the arrival of rave music scene and so forth, and these sort of after-hours parties and things that went on in that period. And as time went on, we covered things like the development of the fashion industry here and how hip-hop came into Thailand. Now, throughout, I've tried to define the mission that I've been on very precisely. Metro Magazine was aimed at being comprehensive and covering all groups and interest levels, from high society all the way down to the simplest places, and also all areas of Bangkok. At that time, before the SkyTrain, people didn't venture very far out of their neighborhoods, their home or work neighborhoods. But now people don't think anything of traveling to suburban areas just to go and buy something or to go to a bar. Time Out was specifically about foreigners who want to come to a country and engage with the local culture and the city life. And Very Thai was, as I said, specifically about this hybrid between modern and traditional. And those are the books that came out. That was about 10 years ago. Now, ever since they've come out, I've had to keep tabs on how things have changed. Some things you notice only after a few years have passed are a trend. And also some of these things that got covered in Very Thai have become part of the mainstream and then reprojected out. This institution was very important in helping to do that. Their first exhibition was on this kind of material, particularly from Isan. But other magazines have had Very Thai themes like covering the street markets and so forth. The writer Prachar Suiranon, he's written a lot about this topic. His most recent book is called Thai, and it looks at this kind of thing as a category of Thainess that has been rather overlooked in comparison to other forms. Also, we started to see this kind of thing being decoded as a form of vernacular design. I mean, people are trying to work out quite how things like street vendor carts fit in. Are they a system? Are they what design lessons can we learn from them? And 10 years ago, when I started on these projects, we didn't get Thai people photographing vendor carts. It just wasn't something you see happening. And now it's extremely common. It's become a subject of Thainess itself. And people take pleasure and interest in photographing these things. And now the vendor carts are starting to be in museums and theme parks. This is in Plern Wan, which is basically a theme park of this kind of stuff. So it's become a part of Thai identity in a way that it simply wasn't when I first arrived in Thailand. So the second edition has now reflects that with some new chapters that look at these phenomena on vernacular design, on the Thai category. Now, one thing that's happened is that Very Thai has had a life of its own. And there's a lesson in this. that sometimes you just have to let go of the control and things can have a life of their own. There's a lot of cultural control in Thailand, and it can cause a lot of difficulties, and it holds back a lot of creativity. But sometimes it really helps when the idea is allowed to be run with. You know, what's happened with Very Thai is it's ended up being used in theatre, in video installations. The book's turned up in various different exhibitions as an artifact itself, as an art piece, as a museum piece, in Bangkok, Chiang Mai, Barcelona, Brussels. There's been a whole mime performance based on it. There's someone uses it as a puppet. They were manipulating it as a puppet, along with other book covers, in the mode of, it was a variation on shadow puppets, but they were using book covers to represent characters. So this book became a character, is acting on stage. People use it in event organizing a lot. So I've had to let this go because people don't tell me about this stuff. I found out about it later. It's off on its own. And this has started to happen in some other formats. One of the most controlled areas of Thai culture is traditional dance. But one thing that's happened is that Pichek Lanchern, who you might well know, his master was outside the traditional system, and he learned from him, and he's fiercely independent. But he did an extraordinary thing. He deconstructed the traditional form by taking the costume off. Now, to a lot of people, this was a bit heretical. It was removing a lot of what people celebrate about Thai dance, the gorgeous costume, the glittery effects, the godlike quality, the certain aspects of Thai dance that are important to do with the costume, a sense of otherworldliness and so forth. But what he did by taking the costume off was show other things about Khon that are there all the time, but you don't notice, like the martial arts aspect of it, the military training side, the way that the arms move in energy circles. This kind of stuff is very interesting, but you miss it completely when you're looking at the beautiful costume. He also sought to explain it. Now, when you go to a traditional Thai dance performance, it's usually not explained. It's a bit better than it used to be in that way. But when I came to Thailand, in my first few days in Bangkok, I went to the National Theatre to try and find out about Thai dance. It basically wasn't on, and when finally I found a production, there was no information. You're supposed to know it already. There was no explanation. Nobody was telling me what it referred to, what kind of drama, what kind of episode it was meant to be, symbolically as well as literally. Whereas Bichet did this, possibly one of the most important theatre productions that's gone around the world in the last 10 years. He paired up with a French person, and they each explained each other's dance cultures. And this was extremely popular internationally. So he's deconstructed it from the point of view of taking the costume off, showing the form, and showing it as a choreography, not just as something that's for a cultural festival, but showing it as a choreographical form that other people can then explore for its movements, for its disciplines. And then he reinterprets it back out again, reinventing the masks, reinventing the costumes, combining traditional form with very unconventional form, but still maintaining the same kind of lines. It's not quite the same as Thai traditional dance, but it's unmistakably Thai. So there's a certain deconstruction that he's done that you could apply in your design work to other conventions where you can't see the structure underneath because of the surface decoration. But underneath there are all kinds of serious and interesting disciplines and structures that are operating there. And these adaptations feed through lots of times. I don't want to get bogged down in performance, but these Thai puppets made with, where you can see the dancing puppeteers manipulating the puppets with sticks. It obviously came from Bunraku originally, from Japan. But people have been riffing on it here, and now there's this amusing one where there's a live dancer manipulated by sticks by other dancers, and it becomes quite funny and very Thai. So there's a lot of mileage. Once you let there be a bit less control, it can get quite interesting out there in terms of new forms. People have also done this with traditional crafts. Goragot Aromdi has done this with the structure used in traditional Thai kites. And he's ended up using these bamboo and ties and things like this in very different forms and let it run with it. It doesn't look anything like a kite, but it's got all kinds of energy, and he's been very successful. There's one of his pieces dominates the reception desk of the Sands Casino in Singapore. So it's seen by millions of people every day. Oh, not every day, every year. Or maybe every day. Now, hidden within these forms, sometimes there's scientific things to discover. Oops, sorry, come back a bit. Sometimes there's scientific things to discover. Now that might be if you're mapping the way that vendors move within an urban space through the day, and you work out the number of different businesses, the number of different products, and the turnover that's happening on one small plot of pavement. Actually, it's incredibly efficient. It's more efficient than a lot of shops are. So what it looks like, absolute chaos with bits of string and tarpaulin and gas canisters and all this sort of mess, but actually it's very efficient. There's all kinds of things that happen in the traditional culture and herbalism. There's lots of scientific properties to discover there. People have done mapping of human attention, like how people conceive and look physically. They've done this through looking at the mind and through the point of view of where the eyes go. And they found that generally Thais, like most Asians, look at things in a much more circular way than Westerners who look at things in a linear way. This has huge implications for how you arrange buildings. It's interesting how galleries are so often arranged in a more circular way in Thailand. This has implications for design of all sorts of different things, particularly events. And even in mathematics, it's quite interesting how there are correlations between Lai Tai and the way that it has got decoration that can scale up and scale down. And it's all about the edges of things. Actually, when it comes down to basically the meaning of the universe, mathematical constants that they've discovered, most famously the Mandelbrot set, which is it's a mathematical constant in the universe. And when it's mapped and computer with color values, you end up with something that looks like Lai Tai. And it's all about what goes on at the edges. So, I mean, that's a very interesting thing for somebody to take on looking at fractal imagery and linking it to Lai Tai. I think there's something fascinating there because Thais have ended up with this stylistic version through their own, something in the culture's led them to that. And one of the fascinating things about light fractals, you can't see it at this magnification, but if you go in or further out, you will notice there's a recurring shape, which looks a bit like the number 8, but it also looks something else. You basically get this shape that looks like the Buddha, even with the third eye, with the circle on top of the head of energy and further up, even the energy coming out the side. This form recurs over and over in nature. So, I mean, don't be afraid of looking at scientific insights into something that's never really been looked at that way before. Because, of course, there is this stricture in Thailand, Mai Chua La Lok Lu. I mean, which is really, don't look too deeply because you'll upset people who believe in something literally. And that's good manners. It might not be good design, might not be good science. It's very good manners in Thailand. But it does hold people back from investigating and questioning and testing and measuring and mapping and asking questions. Because it is a fact that seniority and beliefs will often trump decisions about aesthetics or practicality when it comes down to design. And there's a lot of delicacy about using traditional forms for modern functions if they've got beliefs related to them. We've seen this with hotels that resemble temples and spas that have got altar references and things. We've seen internationally people using Buddha imagery without a cultural filter. So there's Hollywood posters with someone sitting on top of the Buddha. There's Buddha on a bikini top, and Buddha even on a shoe. This makes Thai people feel very uncomfortable. But it works both ways, because we've also seen imagery that offends the outside world in Thailand happen quite a lot. And there's a very famous brand that reformed itself in Thailand, which went from Darky to Dali, and then changed the blackface to some sort of generic human face. So this is a cultural filter physically before our eyes here of how the filter's been applied to a Thai product because of awareness. Now it's also quite interesting to consider that not just Thais, but also foreigners design in Thai style. And they sometimes do this with more freedom than Thais have, because they don't have these restraints from within the culture that hold them back from maybe being a bit impolite in their research. But it does give all these people that I've mentioned up here, insider outsiders. And their work's quite interesting to consider in the history of Thai design. Obviously, Jim Thompson is by far the most famous, but possibly Ed Tuttle's the most influential, because a certain kind of minimalist contemporary design that feels Thai was pretty much invented by him at Amampuri and at the Sukhothai Hotel. He was the first one to refine this style. And Cocoon were probably the first people to really work out ways in household goods, lots of kitchen and household utensils and so forth. What they worked out in the shop, they were Swiss, I think. The shop's now gone, but the mainstream of Thai-style stuff you see in department stores is heavily influenced by the stuff they put out. Patricia Cheeseman, she deals with textiles and indigo in the north. Angus Hutchin is always there at the big fair. He's done a lot of innovation in this area. Same with Alexander Lamont, Gilles Caffier, the late Carol Olivieri, and also Jiro Endo, a Japanese designer. He does a lot of event design at places like Dude Sweet, Fat Festival, Big Mountain Festival. He does a lot of installations that are utilizing Thai style in an event organizing situation. Of course, I'm not overly crediting these people. They're a minority within the scene, but they have had an unmistakable impact. And perhaps part of that is that they're able to overcome taboos that are difficult for Thais to overcome, or hold Thais back a little bit in terms of challenging norms. But sometimes the benefits may be worth a little bit of awkwardness. Orange did an interesting thing with mobile phone. there's a question of trying to fit all of these extra letters onto the keypads. In the West, we've only got 26 letters to deal with, plus a few punctuation. There's so many more Thai letters and marks. And they had this very, very interesting idea that was taken from the yantra and utilized the similarity between the yantra and the initial loops in Thai letters to base the letters according to where the initial loop is positioned. And then with the marks that go, and the marks and vowels that go above, below, before or after in those same positions. I mean, it's a very clever resolution, but I don't think it caught on. But it shows how someone can go into something as they're actually going into how people write in order to affect how people type. It's quite an interesting idea. Some companies have adapted things from sacred forms into secular forms. This can be a delicate area, but you can see that when there's a sufficient distance, there's not really a problem. I mean, this very famous chair from Yotaka was inspired by the kind of seats that monks sit on, but it doesn't look like a monk's chair. You know, it's basically a comfortable chair for sitting cross-legged on, and has become a design classic. And craft factor inspired by the glass mosaic in their furnishings. It's very interesting to look at Thai flower design because it's a deconstructing and reconstructing form in itself. Because what happens is that flowers are broken down into the separate parts and then put back together very often as a different flower. So you'll find that maybe roses and crown flowers and globe amaranths are put together to make a lotus bud, which is quite interesting as a concept. It's a very sophisticated and advanced design concept to do this, but it's part of the tradition. Now, some designers have also applied techniques from outside. Sakun Intakun trained in engineering. And so he brought to Thai flower design all kinds of ideas to do with load bearing and structure, and he looks at flowers from a sort of, as though they're a building material or something. And the end results are often used with heavy structures like metal and wood, and he's reinvented the form of how these things can be. And they've got international appeal because they can be used in a more modern environment without they're meeting halfway towards modern styling. And a young designer, her name's further up here, it's on an earlier slide, she used origami to work out the overall style and effect of those different flowers in different positions and then replicate them with folds in paper. It's incredibly complicated. And the idea of this, rather like with Sakun, is also to be able to create floral offerings for the Thai market that can be used instead of flowers that perish. But also they've got great potential in abstracting Thai flower design and making it as famous as Ikebana. Why shouldn't it be as famous as Ikebana around the world? It's just as interesting and just as based on a theoretical concept. Some people, like Wishara Wish, have gone back to traditional forms of Thai clothing, was all sort of folded and pleated and knotted and draped. And she won a Mango Award from the fashion house in Europe for this collection. Sometimes a way to reformat or look anew at a Thai cultural form is to link it in to a global phenomenon. Now, we're very often used to looking at Thai things in isolation. So something like Thai folk music, in this case Morlam, here it's thought of in connection to its geographic location, Isan, and it's very often to do with a class as to who's enjoying it, who's going along to the venues. Basically, middle-class Bangkokians wouldn't be seen dead at a Morlan club a few years ago. It would be purely for migrants from the northeast and a few Farang who venture out there. But the Thai GJ Maftsai and his English colleague Chris Menist, they got into the music, but they've taken it further by linking it into the world music trend. And so they've re-platformed this music by putting it on a level with music like reggae or music from Latin America or Africa, other ones that are listened to around the world. Suddenly, when they do their parties and tours in the West, people are hearing it as a world music that they didn't know before. And this then brings a credibility that allows middle-class Bangkokians to feel comfortable about going to see a concert by Morlam experts in Tonglaw. You now get Morlam played in Tonglaw, and you get very chic people going there to listen to it, getting really into it because it's really good music, but they didn't listen to it because the cultural barriers had prevented them getting to see its qualities. They've diversified in a whole range of areas. They've got the whole thing covered now. And they also are starting to research in regional musics in Indonesia, in Malaysia, in Cambodia, and so forth. It's part of a bit of a world trend to do this. I've got a friend in Cambodia who does this, trying to revive music that was lost under the Khmer Rouge. So it's part of a trend, but it's enabled a new flowering of this music. And so there's new recordings being done in this old style, and there's a super group being made of masters of these, of the Morlam instruments and singing styles who've been put together. And they're now showcased and getting credit that they never used to get before as being great artists. So it's a bit like a Buena Vista Social Club or a Preservation Hall jazz band equivalent. And they brought Cuban music and New Orleans music into another bracket of world fame. And I think the Paradise Bangkok big band sound will do that for Morlam. Another thing they did at their venues was they rehabilitated Yardong. Now, this was another thing that got relegated to the back streets. It falls foul of the various rules about food and drink and so forth. And also, it's a bit impolite being aphrodisiac, of course. But they brought it in as, you know, every time you go into the Paradise Bangkok gig, you'd get a CD of the music, and you'd get a voucher for a shot of Yardong. Not to everyone's taste, but I think there's a marketing opportunity in there. You've even got the generic shape of the bottle, the cloth stopper. You can put herbs that can have different attributes. I mean, why shouldn't this be the next Bacardi Breezer, you know? I mean, realistically, it could be a world brand idea. Nobody's done it yet, but it could have very interesting packaging and very interesting effects if it really is an aphrodisiac. Now, one area to do with herbs that you're probably quite familiar with, when I came to Thailand, herbalism was dying out. It really was on the way out. The environment was being wrecked and the plants were disappearing from the forests. Also, Western medicine was pushing it into the margins, and you tended only to see it in little areas outside national parks where you'd see the bark and the roots and twigs and things like that in a very crude form. And over the past decade, it's been transformed by the spa industry, and famous brands like Han and Tan they started to market it in a way that's become a bit of a sort of business school textbook case already. They put them in the shape of rice grains. They used rice bran oil, all this kind of stuff. This is where the science comes in. In order to sell this abroad, they have to get it all tested and meet FDA and all these other standards. So there's a certain level at which the testing of this needs to reach a new level. But also, in appealing back into the market here, this old shop, More Wan, or sort of Dr. Sweet in the old town of Bangkok, has repackaged very much in an old-style way, which turns something that was probably very cheap into something very expensive. But that's really the future of a lot of these things which are very handmade in the past. They, when you put that amount of handiwork and care into it at a higher level of refinement in the ingredients and packaging, then the price rockets, right? But it makes new industries. Now, we've looked at various different design fields. I've tried to cover each of the different design areas. One of them is retail. Now, you might have been to Chinatown recently and noticed that out of all the shops in Chinatown, somehow this one has become a magnet. It was a generic corner shop, old mom and pop shop, where it was just a mess of stuff on shelves. It was chaotic. And so, new generation owner, he hires a food stylist, Carb Studio, and they turned that clutter to its advantage, to sort of group it and make it into blocks, and a sense of pattern emerges. And it's still got a very friendly character with the cat sleeping on the produce. But in the street, it suddenly got more presence. And what's special about this is that it hasn't changed the shop's business. It still sells the same kind of stuff in the same location. So it's preserved the character of Chinatown as a place to go for this kind of dried produce, and it hasn't disrupted the character of the place as it would have been had it been a purely something like a 7-Eleven style shop replaced it. So it's heritage preservation actually through retail design. Another company in Chiang Mai, Ginger, has taken a lot of signifiers like hill tribe products and ethnic textiles. They have a certain look that's either quite sort of Siam society at one end, or else very backpacker at the other end. But they've made these textiles and pom-poms and all this kind of stuff into quite a funky interior design setup, using a lot of very bright colours. And they've also turned to melamine, which is a very, it's a food court kind of, food stall kind of quality material. But they've made it very funky with all the stacking lunch boxes and spoons and stuff, using this kind of pop palette. Now, sometimes the people have gone into the form of a product to see how it could be reinvented. This is a fascinating one. Thai food, of course, requires a pestle and mortar. It's quite heavy and quite dirty and quite difficult as a thing to export, because it's made of stone, right? But this company thought of something very clever and simple and clean. They make a tube with a slot in it where you put the ingredients, and then you put this stone slug. You reconnect it together, and then you shake it. And this is a new way of pounding out the ingredients to make your Thai food. But it's very, very suitable for compact kitchens of condominiums and for Western kitchens or international kitchens that want to it helps support the whole Thai food push abroad. And apparently it's quite effective. And it's quite fun. Now, obviously, Sanuk gets into a lot of design. You see all sorts of impromptu design everywhere. I love this. This was at somebody's birthday party, and I said, look, I've just got to photograph your birthday melon. They didn't like cake. So they decided to put the candles in a melon. But this kind of adaptation of an import is totally delightful. And it makes everyone laugh. It's engaging. And another very famous company that's been doing this, I mean, I don't think they need an introduction. Maybe they need some new concepts because they've not been doing many new things for a while. But they've played around with a lot of forms, and they've had the whole series based on Mr. P. And Osisu's very well known for its recycling of wood, but also all the forms are very witty and funny, and they've got something in common with the kinds of benches that you see motorcycle taxi drivers reclining on. Now, this kind of found objects in the street are often put together with a lot of fun and wit, but using casual materials. And a company called 56 Studio has taken this a step further by making the laundry baskets and the drinks crates into chairs. Now, when you consider the inspiration for this kind of thing, maybe we can go back to that public furniture that's in the street and maybe look at that again. I mean, motorcycle taxi drivers have been reclining on these kinds of objects for a very long time. They sit on crates and bits of recycled wood. Now, one thing that's happened with motorcycle taxis is that when I came here, they all used to be in individual jackets, which was in its own way quite a signature thing. And then when I was writing very Thai, very annoyingly, they got standardized. But actually something happened when it got standardized, is that it became an icon. They weren't just everywhere. Suddenly they were everywhere with something consistent. And so there was this subtle change. Also, the motorcycle taxi drivers became quite prominent in the protests that have happened, and they started to appear on election posters and all this sort of stuff. They got noticed. There were some reforms done to improve their job dignity and professionalism and so forth. They were registered, they were given certain rights as, in terms of social welfare and so on. And this is quite interesting to look at them as a service being modified through design, because the jacket became symbolic of moving away from mafia towards registration, towards professionalism, towards trust of the customer, etc. There's another aspect of their presence that's started. There are some shelters that have been erected, but the problem is they're for the passengers. The passengers almost never need to wait for a motorcycle taxi driver. These guys are waiting in the sun all day for those people to come along. But the shelter is oriented for status reasons towards the customer. And it's almost spiteful. You know, these seat handles mean that the poor guy can't recline. I mean, look, he's completely wedged between these metal struts. So I think there's a very interesting opportunity. Every street corner has a motorcycle taxi rank. Just imagine if they had the character of the kiosks in Paris, which are so much part of the cultural signature of the city that are on every street corner. And in England, the phone box. I mean, they've got the capacity to become a symbol of the place. So through looking at the provision of a service design of the motorcycle taxis, there's the potential also to create something that can be a signature of the city in the world. And actually, there is something. I mean, Bangkok's not very known for its public design. I mean, really, on the street level, it's very chaotic. But there is one signature design which I've always loved, which is the Bts Porch. I mean, when I saw it, I immediately thought it's a dancer's hand. It's such a nice, simple gesture, and it's got this cascading, very light feeling for something that's a huge superstructure in the middle of the street. Its presence, when you enter, it's very delicate and very charming. So maybe something along this kind of line could be used as a structure for the motorcycle taxis that could, could combine the queue as to who comes next, or could combine the fares, the routes. Who knows what it can involve? I mean, these kiosks in Paris use all kinds of electronic devices now and rotating advertisements and so on. And I think these concerns are interesting because they talk about the presence of Thailand within the world and as a signature. Thailand's getting to an interesting point at the moment where the ASEAN Union is looming, and Thailand's very preoccupied with presenting itself, but I don't know how preoccupied it is with the context of ASEAN. There's actually a lot in common with the neighbours, and it seems to be that we talk about the differences with the neighbours an awful lot. But actually, when we try to work out what is Thainess, all these contrasts, most of them have been with the West or with Japan or something that's really very different. And is there much use in comparing things that are so different that they need major translation between them? Maybe the real key to Thainess is to look at cultures right next door that are extremely similar and overlap, and then to see the fine differences, the subtle differences between Thainess and Laoness, between Thainess and Khmerness, or Thainess and Burmeseness, or Vietnameseness, or Filipineness. All these subtle differences are quite important. And you can see the subtle differences in the old architecture. This region of the world actually has something in common, is that the houses historically were built of wood without nails, on stilts, and they all generally had some kind of water culture. And so all of the differentiation points went into the roof. But they're all fundamentally very, very similar. So maybe we can think of Thainess in this way. They all have very similar street culture. The street vendors, the pop things in all these countries, they all are of a certain type. Now, going back to that coffee we saw at the beginning, and they've all got this kind of sock coffee. But there's an interesting little innovation that's happened recently. In Bangkok, they're starting to sell the coffee in the bag, putting it in a paper bag, and then putting that in a plastic bag, and then calling it ancient coffee. Café Boran. I don't know whether with the plastic, the paper bag, and then the second layer of plastic is ancient. I'm really not sure quite why it's called Boran, but it is an innovation. It's maybe marks the Thai style a little bit different from somewhere else. Now, this last slide is something I use at universities when I'm talking to students. I tease them, because often it's at a design or architecture course that I'm giving the lecture, and I ask them to identify which is the Thai design. Now, all of you probably have worked out that one at the top left is by Gorikot, who you saw his work earlier. But then, I mean, which is the Thai one? I mean, they could all be Thai. But there's Cambodian, Indonesian, and Philippine design in there. But what it does tell you is that there is such a thing as a Southeast Asian look. All of these don't look like they're from somewhere else in the world. They all look Southeast Asian. So maybe talking about Thainess is not beside the point, but maybe it needs to be coupled with what is Southeast Asian. Because trying to market Thailand in the world as a distinctive place, it's one country out of more than 200 trying to get heard. But ASEAN is one of the biggest blocks of population in the world, and it gets noticed. So maybe working towards a Southeast Asian look is something that could be a way to project Thailand on a bigger platform. It's a bit like the Morlam being put on the platform of world music. It's like re-platforming Thai design to be on a Southeast Asian design platform, and thinking in terms of strength from these common ideas and common materials rather than seeing them only as competitors. So I'll end with a preview of my website, which is almost done. It should, within this month, be coming out. One of the things that's happened beyond my control since it came out was people just started using the Very Thai hashtag on Instagram and Twitter. They just use this and post things with it. But this website will be a channel where all these things can come together. There's a media section of it where it's updated with all of the postings from people in Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and other social media, among other things. And the book itself, we're in this luxury problem of it being reprinted at the moment. So there's very few copies that I've got. There are some in the shops, but it will be reprinted very soon. But if anyone's interested in getting a copy at a discount price, because for TCDC of 10% off, and I will happily sign it. The way we've organised that is that if people put their details on the sheet that's with the handout you've been given, if you do want a copy, give your phone and email details, and I think we can probably have the books for pickup from TCDC, and payment could be made via ATM transfer, something like that. But I'm sorry I don't have a stock of them to sell here, but the cost would be 900 baht instead of the usual 995. So that's the end of the sales pitch.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me? Okay. Thank you, Philip. Okay, this is time for the Q&A section. So I really like the watermelon cakes. This is my favorite. Okay, so any question for asking Philip?
มีกระดาษนะคะที่แจกให้ค่ะถ้าไม่สะดวกไมโครโฟนถามเขียนเป็นกระดาษขึ้นมาก็ได้นะคะเดี๋ยวจะเอาไปส่งให้หรือว่าถ้าใครอยากจะถามมีไมโครโฟนทางนี้2ตัวนะคะถ้ามีคำถามไหมคะ
I got one question from the audience. She said, like, thank you for the wonderful presentation, and I do really enjoy it. Here is my question. If Zen is Japanese philosophies that represents their way of life, what philosophy that Thai people are helping in your opinion?
Well, I think that there's lots of ways that people can look at their own culture. Through the eyes of religion is only one of them. And I think possibly it's one of those predictable formats that maybe hides some of the other things that are lurking behind it. But having said that, Zen really does sum up a lot of the approach of Japanese thinking that's very minimalist, but it also embraces a certain amount of roughness in the design and natural form as the way things are. I think actually Thai beliefs do reflect the design and the popular culture very much, and particularly this way of restyling imports, because Thai religion is extremely eclectic. They call it a syncretic religion. It's a synthesis of lots of other things. So it has Buddhism in there, but it's got Hinduism in there, and it's got Chinese gods, and it's got Christmas, and it's got... There's one of the slides that I sometimes put up here in my talks is a figure on the base of a Buddha statue that's helping to hold it up. It's in gold leaf. It's a statue of David Beckham. And he's even got the Manchester United kit with the sponsor logo across the shirt, even at the time. There's so many different deities and spirits and amulet-like belief figures and characters that are in Thai belief. They're all synthesized into the whole. So I think it sums up in many ways the way that Thais are able to bring things in from lots of different cultural backgrounds, lots of concepts, and to somehow localize them. So actually, I think the Thai version of Zen is this syncretic pantheon of many, many different things.
Is it clear enough?
มีคำถามไหมคะถามภาษา
มี
ไทย
คำ
ได้
ถาม
นะ
เพิ่ม
คะ
เติม
เพ
ไหม
ราะว่า
คะ
มีคุณฟิลิปมีตัวหูฟังแปลภาษานะคะ
Oh, sorry.
You can like speak Thai so you can translate to English. มีคำถามเพิ่มเติมไหมคะโอเคค่ะ
So this is a rather...
ขอบคุณค่ะโอเคค่ะ เป็นคำถามภาษาไทยนะคะ It's a Thai question. Okay. อะไรคืออุปสรรคของการออกแบบในสไตล์ very Thai ตามหนังสือในสังคมไทย เช่น ความศักดิ์สิทธิ์ที่พูดอยู่กับทุกสิ่งจนไม่สามารถแตะต้องได้ It's hard to explain.
Okay, if I understood that right, is sacredness an obstacle to
Right. The
designing
obstacle
Thai?
of Thai. Yes.
I think it's an inescapable fact that there is a lot of particularly cultural forms that are related to sacred objects and buildings and practices, that it's difficult to find Thai forms that don't have some kind of sacred aspect to them. So I think designers need to find a way to maybe shift the ground a little bit, rather than saying it's confronting beliefs or breaking beliefs. Maybe they need to look at a way of formulating it that the end result of what they're trying to achieve is not blasphemous or not against the religion, but that maybe there's a way to, a space that both sides can accept, that a shape can inspire something else and not necessarily be a commentary about the religion or the belief. Maybe there's a way that the form can be treated as being something that doesn't have to be sacred. Maybe I'm not explaining this clearly. I think if you look at something like that monk's chair, for example.
Monk's chairs?
Where...
Oh, okay, I see.
Sorry,
like...
this is actually rather... It's making it difficult for me to speak. The chair looks very, very different from a monk's chair. So if you look at the chair, you'll say it's got a Thai look to it.
Yeah, it's a shape. And... Okay.
The only difficulty is in many ways the designer admitting that he was inspired by a monk's chair.
Right.
And then people make the connection, and then maybe think, oh, he shouldn't be using a monk's chair. It's where the shape is specifically religious, like maybe something to do with the shape of the Buddha or something. But then there's an awful lot of Buddha hands and things sold in markets. I mean, I think there's a lot of double standards with it. There's a lot of very conventional things to do with religion are sold as souvenirs and products. And I think it's just got to be a negotiation, that eventually the culture has to find a way to be comfortable with it. I mean, there was something I noticed when I was making this, I can't think what it was now. It was a traditional form that is now not such a big deal, that is, that's...
Such as?
I'm just trying to remember what it is, it'll come back to me. But it was something that long ago was, had a religious connotations or belief connotations, and I wish I could remember what the object was now. But now
That's okay.
There's not the pressure feeling that it's terribly sacred. That a time might heal these things as well.
Is it? One more question. ค่ะ ถามได้เลยค่ะ
When you're talking about Thainess, and we said about like things that overlap from other culture in Southeast Asian, so I was wondering if there any same situation happen in somewhere such as European or something like that we always transfer the culture and everything, and something we can look at and maybe we study from it and adapt it from it.
Yeah, that's a very good comparison. In Europe, we have a lot of overlapping themes within that span many countries. Classical architecture is obviously one of them. So is Gothic architecture. And then even within that, there will be, say, Baroque, which is certain areas of Central Europe have got that feeling. There's Art Nouveau. Well, do you talk about French Art Nouveau or Czech Art Nouveau? Modern movement. What about the Bauhaus? What about the Amsterdam School in Netherlands? We're maybe more looking at stylistic movements rather than the national origin of where it came. The national origin is a variation on that big umbrella of a cultural style or design style. I don't think that maybe we do talk about Italian design or maybe Britpop, something like that, but I think in many ways, creatively, you tend to think in more terms of as one of those stylistic genres rather than the national design having to be a certain type of thing. So I think that possibly you could look at Southeast Asia. It's got its own sort of informal market style. It's got its variation on forest products style. It's got maybe herbal healing, spa kind of feeling, something like that. Maybe those genres would be more important in the end. And also we look at the individual designers. They become more of an above title person, the actual practitioner, if they're sufficiently good, becomes very famous in their own right. That's very individualistic and Western, I know, but I think we've overcome national ideas of design in a big way.
Is it clear enough? ค่ะ One more question ค่ะ
Hello, nice talk.
Thank you.
Look forward to reading your book. So if we were to look at culture as something that happens from below, as in the things that people live, create, and breathe from below, as opposed to what is imposed by tradition and by academic elites or political elites, and we also take an examination of the phenomena of globalization as, say, cultural imperialism, as we can see evidenced by this mall and all the brands that are sold here, what do you think will be the vestiges of Thai culture like 300 years from now? Do you think it'll look more Thai, or because I mean, if we look at culture as a sense of like othering in terms of, okay, this is Thai because this is in comparison to things that are not Thai, or this is Southeast Asian in comparison to things that are not Southeast Asian. If things are slowly becoming closer and closer and closer based on, this is controversial, but a cultural imperialist form, what do you think will survive the most out of Thai-ness or Southeast Asian-ness?
All right. Well, in 300 years' time, Bangkok may well be back in the sea. So we might have a revival of the water culture. If Sumet Jumsai's got anything to do with it, we will. I think what tends to happen through history is things ebb and flow. You will probably find that there will be a Southeast Asian style emerge just through proximity and the demands of big business and the demands of just distribution and the way that awareness around the world happens through media and through trends and so forth. And then when things come together, then there'll be new fragmentations, but there might be different groupings. What's happened in Europe, for example, Europe slowly came together and overcame some of the problems of national identity, or national identity in the sense of fighting each other as country against country. But what's starting to happen is you get what they call the Europe of the regions. And so you've got Catalonia, or Glasgow, Edinburgh, or the Ruhr Valley leaking into Belgium and Germany, or you get zones that maybe cross borders based on big cities or production areas that link together. And that leads to all sorts of questions about other areas that get left behind. But we might be moving back towards an area that sort of characteristic of city-states, which was very typical in the Middle Ages. And in this region, well, we've already got growth triangles and all this kind of stuff, Medan linked with Hadyai and Penang, So you may well have linkages, lines, like basically Thailand's going to be one big crossroads. You're going to have the railway and the roads between Singapore and China, and then the railway and the roads between Vietnam and Burma, and they'll cross over at Pitsanulok. They won't cross over in Bangkok necessarily. So the energy of where the economic development happens may well shift. But basically, historically, Southeast Asia was all about rivers and coasts, and a little bit about trails over mountains. But in the future, the growth will go where the flow is happening, and the flow may well be right in the middle of the country, coming across Isan and going, then taking a right turn and going up into China or something. Bangkok might not be quite the center it is now, although it's still, if you look at Southeast Asia, it's the best positioned city in many ways. So I don't think Bangkok will lose its significance, but I'd imagine certain areas that are en route to other places will grow in importance. And there's also an interesting look at Bangkok that people have started, which is a sort of neo-futurist noir kind of look. Some science fiction writers and filmmakers are starting to look at Bangkok in this way, and they're seeing the street life in a kind of, as a very adaptable format for some of these disruptive new technologies, and that it's more responsive than, say, some of the rigid structures we have from the West. So Southeast Asia might be an interesting part of the world because it's so street-oriented. But in the short answer, I don't know what will happen in 300 years. But I think there'll be some of these things will happen, probably.
Like speed railway? I don't know. Any
มีคำถาม
question?
อีกไหมคะ
มีความถามเพิ่มเติมไหมคะ ไม่มีนะคะโอเคค่ะอันนี้ก็ถึงเวลาแล้วนะคะขอเชิญคุณพิชิตวิรังคบุตรนะคะ Directors of Event and exhibition of TCDC, giving you souvenirs from TCDC. And thank you very much for sharing. ค่ะเดี๋ยวจะมีใบประเมินนะคะยังไงสามารถส่งได้ที่ด้านหน้านะคะของห้องออดิทอเรียมนะคะแล้วก็จะมีใบจองหนังสือนะคะของคุณฟิลิป Very Thai นะคะสามารถส่งได้พร้อมกับใบ evaluation เลยนะคะถ้าใครสนใจหนังสือของ Very Thai ของคุณฟิลิปนะคะวันนี้ขอบคุณมากค่ะสวัสดีค่ะ